By sacred law, I owe you offspring for saving me, cowboy, the Apache Widow said with a smile. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Silas Mercer had not planned to be that far south before nightfall, but the fence line near the dry wash had sagged again, and he did not leave work unfinished once he started it. Not anymore. He moved along the boundary slowly, checking wire tension, resetting a leaning post, counting how much daylight he had left without looking directly at the sun, because he had learned over years that guessing wrong out here cost more than comfort. He lived alone by choice, not because solitude was gentle, but because it was predictable. After years spent moving with other men, carrying orders he did not agree with and consequences he never outran, distance had become the only way he knew how to breathe without tension sitting in his chest. The land did not argue with him. It only demanded attention. His horse slowed on its own near the wash, ears shifting, body registering something before Silas allowed himself to see it. He followed the animal's line of sight and noticed a shape where nothing should have been, low against the ground, too still to be brush, too deliberate to be debris. His first response was not panic, but caution, the kind that came from experience rather than fear. People rarely collapsed in places like this by accident. When they did, there was usually a reason that did not end well. He dismounted without rushing, one hand resting lightly on the saddle horn, scanning the area before committing himself to stepping closer. There were no fresh tracks beyond his own and the horse's, no broken brush that suggested a struggle, no sound except wind brushing against stone. Even so, his shoulders remained tight, his breathing controlled, his mind already running through options he hoped he would not need. When he closed the distance, he saw that the figure was a woman, her body angled toward the shallow dip of the wash as if she had crawled there intentionally, seeking the last trace of shade the land could offer. She was conscious enough to position herself, but not enough to move anymore. One arm was pressed against her side, fingers rigid, the other half buried in dirt. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, controlled but strained, and Silas recognized the effort behind it. Pain like that did not announce itself loudly. It narrowed the world until survival became mechanical. Her clothing told him who she was before her face did. Deerskin, worn thin and patched with care, not ceremonial, not decorative, meant for movement and endurance. Her skin was darkened by sun and dust, her hair loose from its braid and sticking to her cheek. She was young, but the tension in her body suggested she had learned alertness early. Silas felt a tightening in his stomach that had nothing to do with danger to himself. He had seen too many people left where they fell because helping them required time, risk, and explanation. He had walked away before. He had lived with that choice. He crouched beside her, far enough not to startle her if she woke suddenly, and watched for a full breath cycle before reaching out, checking for blood, for heat, for signs of fever. When she inhaled sharply and flinched under his touch, he pulled his hand back immediately, speaking quietly, not to calm her, but to signal that he was there. Her eyes opened then, dark and focused despite exhaustion, locking onto his face without confusion. There was no plea in them, no gratitude either, only assessment, as if she were deciding whether fighting him would cost more than letting him act. That look stayed with him longer than it should have. He had not expected clarity. He had expected fear. In that moment, the choice stopped feeling abstract. Leaving her would not just mean walking away from a stranger. It would mean actively deciding that his isolation mattered more than her survival. And that line, once crossed, did not uncross itself. He lifted her carefully, adjusting when her body went rigid and reflex, aware of how little she weighed, aware, too, of how tightly she held herself together even while barely conscious. She did not resist, but she did not relax either. The walk back to the cabin took longer than usual, not because of distance, but because Silas controlled every step, every shift of weight, aware that one misjudged movement could worsen her condition. His thoughts stayed practical, focused on water, shade, clean cloth, the limitations of what he could offer without a doctor or town nearby. Fear crept in quietly, not fear of her, but fear of failing at something that now rested squarely in his hands. When the cabin came into view, weathered with standing alone against open land, Silas felt the unfamiliar weight of responsibility settle in his chest. He had built this place to keep the world out. Now he was carrying the world inside. He opened the door with his shoulder and laid her down on the narrow bed, stepping back immediately once she was settled, giving her space, steadying himself, already preparing for the work ahead. Outside, the light continued to fade, indifferent to what had changed. Inside, Silas stood still for a moment longer than necessary, aware that whatever followed would alter the careful, controlled life he had constructed, and knowing, without argument, that he would see it through. The cabin felt smaller once she was inside it, not because the walls had moved, but because Silas became aware of how much of his life had been arranged for one body and one set of habits. And now, there was another presence breathing unevenly on his bed. He stood near the door for a moment, listening to the change in sound, the way her breath broke the familiar quiet, and he forced himself to slow down before doing anything else. Panic led to mistakes. He had learned that lesson early. He washed his hands at the basin first, scrubbing longer than necessary, grounding himself in the cold bite of water against his skin, then returned to her side with deliberate care. The wound at her ribs was not fresh, but it was angry, the skin swollen and discolored, suggesting impact rather than a blade. He cut away a section of her clothing only where needed, careful not to expose more than necessary, because dignity mattered even when the person was barely conscious. As he cleaned the area, her jaw tightened and her breath stuttered, and Silas adjusted his pressure immediately, speaking again in a low, steady voice, explaining what he was doing even though he did not know how much she understood. She reacted to his proximity more than his touch. Her muscles stayed coiled, ready, as if rest had become a risk rather than relief. Silas recognized that response. He had carried it himself for years. It told him more about her past than any words could have. He worked efficiently, binding the injury with clean cloth, setting water within reach, then stepping back far enough that she would not wake to find him hovering. When she stirred again, it was fully this time. Her eyes opened and stayed open, tracking the room, the ceiling beams, the table, the window, the door. She took in the space quickly, cataloging exits and distance, then finally looked at him. He did not move closer. He leaned against the far wall instead, hands visible, posture open but not inviting. "You're safe here," he said, not because he was certain of it, but because she needed something solid to hold on to. "Water's there. I won't touch you without asking." She did not answer right away. Her gaze dropped to the bandage, then to the knife resting on the table where he had deliberately left it in sight, not hidden, not offered. That choice was intentional. Control came from honesty, not reassurance. After a long moment, she nodded once, a small movement that cost her effort. Silas turned away after that, giving her privacy while he tended to the fire and prepared food simple enough for a weak stomach. He kept his movements audible so she would never be surprised by where he was. Every decision he made carried the same question beneath it: how to help without imposing, how to stay without claiming. The balance was unfamiliar and demanding. As night settled in, the temperature dropped fast, and he placed an extra blanket near her without covering her himself. When she finally slept, it was light and guarded, but it was sleep. Silas did not sit beside her. He took the chair by the door instead, facing outward, rifle resting nearby, listening to the land and the rhythm of her breathing behind him. He understood then that this was no longer about a stranger in need. It was about responsibility taken without certainty, about choosing involvement when isolation would have been easier. The cabin held both of them now, and whatever followed would not be temporary. Morning entered the cabin without ceremony, pale light pushing through the window and settling across the floorboards, revealing details Silas usually ignored because they never changed: the worn edge of the table, the crack near the stove, the place where his boots always landed when he stood up. This time, the stillness felt different, weighted by awareness. He woke before she did, not from sound, but from the instinct that told him another person was breathing under his roof. He checked her condition before doing anything else, staying at a distance while watching the rise of her chest, the color returning slowly to her face, the way her hand no longer clenched the blanket as tightly as it had during the night. Relief came quietly, without satisfaction. He had not saved her yet. He had only kept her alive long enough to reach the next decision. Silas stepped outside to start the day as he always did, drawing water from the well, feeding the horse, scanning the horizon out of habit rather than expectation. His reason for being here had never changed. He worked this land because it required no allegiance, because survival here depended on attention, not obedience. After leaving organized patrol work years earlier, he had chosen this place specifically because it sat between routes, overlooked by towns and ignored by anyone looking for authority or comfort. The cabin was not a retreat. It was a boundary. When he returned inside, she was awake and sitting upright, her back against the wall, posture rigid but controlled. The blanket had been folded rather than pulled close, and her eyes followed him the moment he crossed the threshold. She had taken stock of the space while he was gone. He could tell by the way her gaze moved with purpose, not curiosity. He placed a tin cup of water on the table between them and stepped back again. She reached for it carefully, testing her balance before committing, and when the pain registered, she did not hide it, nor did she exaggerate it. That restraint told him more than any explanation could have. She drank slowly, never breaking eye contact for long, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "My name is Nayeli." Silas nodded once. Silas. Nothing more followed immediately. Names, he knew, carried weight. Offering one was not casual. He let the silence remain intact rather than filling it with reassurance that would sound thin even to himself. She spoke again after a pause, her English careful, structured, learned through necessity rather than choice. She told him she had been traveling alone, that the injury came from a fall made worse by exhaustion, that her husband was dead and had been for some time. She did not describe how or why. She stated it as fact, like weather or distance. When she mentioned that she had not expected to wake up, her expression did not change. Silas felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the pressure that came when responsibility expanded beyond what he could measure. He did not interrupt her. He did not look away either. Listening was part of the cost of staying. When she finished, she explained the law of her people as she understood it, not as ritual, but as structure. Survival, she said, was not accidental. If a man chose to save a widow, he accepted duty toward her future. The words were not framed as a request. They were offered so he would understand what she believed had been set in motion. Silas took longer to answer than she likely expected. He considered the difference between her meaning and his own, the space between obligation and consent, between shelter and ownership. Finally, he spoke plainly, telling her she would not be forced into anything under his roof, that she could leave when she was strong enough, that staying would only ever be her choice. She studied him again, more carefully this time, not for threat, but for inconsistency. Finding none she could prove, she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the boundary without agreeing to abandon her belief. The day passed with small adjustments. She moved only when necessary. He altered his routines to give her space without withdrawing entirely. Nothing resolved itself, but something steadied. By evening, the cabin held two people who understood that their lives had intersected for reasons neither fully controlled, and that what came next would depend not on law or promise, but on what they chose to do when morning arrived again. The fourth day marked a shift that neither of them announced, but both felt immediately, a subtle change in the way time moved inside the cabin, slower in some moments, tighter in others, as if the space itself was adjusting to holding two lives instead of one. Silas woke before dawn again, his body still trained to rise before light, but this time he did not leave the cabin right away. He sat on the edge of his chair, boots unlaced, listening, not for danger outside, but for movement behind him, for signs that Nayeli was awake, in pain, or struggling alone. She was sitting by the time he stood, not on the bed, but on the chair nearest the wall, posture upright, hands resting flat on her thighs as if grounding herself. She had wrapped the blanket around her shoulders with deliberate care, keeping it secure but not hiding behind it. The wound at her ribs was clearly bothering her, visible in the controlled way she breathed, yet she did not lean or brace herself against anything. Silas recognized the effort in that choice. Pride and survival often share the same muscles. "You should stay seated," he said, not as an order, but as information. "Too much movement will slow the healing." She met his eyes without flinching. "Stillness weakens the body," she replied after a pause, her words measured. "Pain teaches where the limit is." Silas accepted that without argument. He had learned long ago that correcting someone else's survival logic rarely worked. Instead, he adjusted his own, moving the table slightly closer to her, setting food and water within easier reach, then stepping away again so she would not feel watched while eating. Every decision he made was filtered through the same quiet calculation: how to help without taking control, how to offer without turning presence into pressure. After breakfast, he gathered tools to check the fence line closer to the cabin, choosing tasks that would keep him within sight without forcing proximity. Nayeli observed him from the doorway, her gaze steady, following not just what he did, but how he did it, the care he took in simple actions, the absence of hurry, the way he scanned the land even when nothing moved. She was learning his patterns the same way he had learned hers, through observation rather than interrogation. While he worked, she stepped outside for the first time since waking, testing her balance on the uneven ground, one hand briefly touching the doorframe before she released it. The air was cool, carrying the smell of dust and wood smoke, and she closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a full breath despite the discomfort. Silas noticed the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. He did not comment on it. Relief, he knew, could feel like vulnerability if named too soon. She asked then why he lived so far from town, the question posed without accusation, simply curiosity sharpened by caution. Silas did not answer immediately. He finished tightening a wire, straightened, and wiped his hands on his trousers before speaking, giving the truth the time it deserved. "I needed a place where my decisions didn't carry other men with them," he said. "Out here, if something goes wrong, it's on me alone." That was all he offered. He did not explain the years before, the patrols, the orders, the faces that returned uninvited in quiet moments. Nayeli did not press him. She understood restraint when she heard it. Later, while he chopped wood, she moved slowly along the interior wall of the cabin, organizing items without rearranging them, learning where things belonged rather than imposing her own order. She folded cloths, cleaned a section of the table, and set aside damaged stitching from her clothing, clearly planning to repair it when her strength allowed. Silas felt something unfamiliar tighten behind his ribs at the sight. Not ownership, not gratitude, recognition. She was not behaving like someone waiting to be told what she was allowed to do. She was acting like someone deciding whether this place could hold her without erasing her. By afternoon, clouds gathered low on the horizon, signaling weather that would make travel difficult within days. Silas checked supplies again, mentally recalculating quantities now that they were not meant for one. He did not resent the adjustment. He resented only the part of himself that had once believed solitude was the same as peace. Nayeli noticed the change in his routine and asked what he was preparing for. When he explained the weather, she nodded once and said she would stay until she could walk without pain, then reconsider her path. The words were careful, non-committal, honest. Silas respected that more than promises. That night, they ate together at the table for the first time, not facing each other directly, but angled slightly, sharing space without demand. Conversation remained sparse, but the silence had shifted. It no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a mutual decision. When darkness settled fully, Silas banked the fire and prepared to take his usual place near the door. Before he could sit, Nayeli spoke again, her voice steady but quieter than before. "I do not believe you owe me your life," she said, "but I believe staying is not weakness." Silas considered her words carefully, then nodded. "Neither is leaving," he replied. She accepted that answer, and for the first time since he had found her, her shoulders relaxed completely. Outside, the land remained indifferent, unchanged, but inside the cabin, something had begun to take shape. Not a bond yet, not trust fully formed, but a structure strong enough to build on, grounded in respect, restraint, and the shared understanding that whatever came next would be chosen, not taken. The fifth morning arrived with a dry wind moving steadily across the open ground, strong enough to carry sound farther than usual, and Silas noticed it before he opened his eyes, the faint whistle at the cabin's edge telling him that anything approaching today would announce itself early. He rose quietly, already adjusting his plans, because conditions like this changed how the land behaved and how people moved through it. The routine he relied on had always been flexible by necessity. Nayeli was awake when he turned from the basin, seated at the table this time rather than near the wall, her posture straighter than the day before, the color in her face more stable. The injury still limited her, but the sharp edge of weakness had dulled. Silas took note of that without comment. Improvement, he had learned, could disappear just as quickly if acknowledged too soon. "You hear it too," she said, nodding toward the window. "The wind," he replied, "carries trouble farther than it should." She absorbed that quietly. Among her people, weather had never been background. It was instruction. She understood immediately what he meant without needing explanation. After a simple meal, Silas prepared to ride the perimeter closest to the cabin, choosing the shortest loop that still gave him sight lines over the approach routes. He told Nayeli where he would be and how long he expected to be gone, not because she needed permission, but because information reduced uncertainty. She watched him check his rifle, not with fear, but with the focused attention of someone measuring capability rather than threat. "I will stay inside," she said. "If someone comes, I will not hide." Silas paused at the door, studying her carefully, weighing instinct against judgment. He did not doubt her resolve. He questioned only the risk. "Stay near the back wall," he said finally. "If voices come before I do, don't answer." She nodded once. It was not submission. It was agreement. The ride was uneventful until it wasn't. Near the western marker, Silas spotted fresh tracks crossing the hardpan, shallow but recent, a single horse moving at an unhurried pace. Not a scout, not a drifter in a rush. Someone curious. His jaw tightened slightly as he followed the marks with his eyes, calculating distance and timing, adjusting his route to loop back sooner than planned. When he returned, the horse already stood near the cabin, reins loose, its rider dismounted and waiting in the open as if deliberately avoiding the appearance of threat. Silas slowed, keeping his approach visible, his posture neutral but unyielding. The man turned when Silas came into view, offering a nod that carried familiarity without invitation. "Didn't expect company this far out," the rider said casually. "Heard you kept to yourself." Silas stopped a measured distance away. "I do." The man glanced toward the cabin, his gaze lingering a second longer than necessary. Silas noticed immediately and shifted his stance just enough to block the line of sight without making a show of it. The rider's expression changed, subtle but telling. "You got someone with you now?" he observed. "I've got work to finish," Silas replied. "And you're in the way of it." The wind carried the silence between them, stretching it thin. The rider weighed his options quickly. Whatever he had hoped to find, it wasn't worth pressing for. He gave a short shrug, mounted again, and rode off without another word. Silas did not relax until the sound of hooves was fully swallowed by distance. Only then did he dismount, every sense still tuned sharp. Nayeli stood in the doorway, exactly where she had said she would be, shoulders squared, eyes steady. "You saw him before I did," she said. "Yes." He was measuring. "Yes." No further explanation was needed. She had lived among men who measured value differently. Silas understood that without her saying it. Inside, the cabin felt altered by the encounter, not threatened, but claimed in a new way, defined by a shared boundary rather than isolation. Silas checked the door, secured the window latch, and adjusted where he stored supplies, all small changes that added up to intention. That afternoon, Naeli asked to help prepare dried meat. Silas hesitated only long enough to consider her injury, then agreed, modifying the work so she could sit while cutting. Their hands worked separately, but in rhythm, silence filled with purpose rather than distance. "This place," she said eventually, "you defend it like a living thing." Silas considered that. "I maintain it," he corrected. "Defense invites questions." She accepted the distinction, then added something he had not expected. "You did not claim me when he looked. You placed yourself between." Silas met her gaze evenly. "That's where I stand when something's mine to protect." The words settled heavily, not because of possession, but because of choice. He had not said it lightly, and she knew that. That evening, as the light faded and the wind eased, they shared a quiet meal, the tension of the day unwinding slowly. Naeli's movements were more confident now, her presence less guarded. Silas noticed himself planning the coming weeks with her included, adjusting routes, supply use, work schedules, without consciously deciding to do so. When night settled fully, there were no questions left unspoken, only understanding built from action. Outside, the land remained vast and indifferent. Inside, two people shared responsibility without naming it, aware that whatever path unfolded from here would no longer be walked alone, and that neither of them intended to turn away from it. The days that followed settled into a pattern that neither of them announced, yet both quietly relied on, shaped by necessity rather than comfort. And Silas became aware of it only when he realized he was no longer counting time by light alone, but by the sound of movement inside the cabin. Morning no longer began with silence, broken only by his own steps. There was the soft scrape of a chair, the controlled pause before Naeli stood, the measured way she tested her balance before committing to motion. These sounds altered his awareness of the space without distracting him from his work. They grounded him. Her strength returned in increments small enough to avoid notice unless one was watching closely. The stiffness in her movements eased, replaced by careful efficiency, and though pain still shaped how she carried herself, it no longer defined her limits. Silas adjusted tasks accordingly, not announcing changes, simply placing tools where she could reach them, choosing work that allowed shared focus without shared strain. He did not offer praise. He offered opportunity. By midweek, she asked to walk the short distance to the water barrels herself. Silas hesitated longer than he would have liked, not because he doubted her resolve, but because he understood the cost of pushing too far too soon. He agreed only after making it clear that turning back would not be failure. She accepted the condition without comment. They walked side by side without touching, the space between them deliberate but not distant, and Silas noticed how her attention remained outward rather than inward, tracking the land, the slope of ground, the way sound carried differently depending on direction. She was not merely recovering. She was orienting herself, reclaiming awareness that injury and exhaustion had narrowed. When they reached the barrels, she rested briefly, then nodded once, satisfied, and turned back without asking to continue farther. Silas felt a quiet respect settle into place. Restraint, he knew, was a form of strength rarely acknowledged. That evening, as he repaired a section of harness by the fire, Naeli spoke again of her people's law, not repeating what she had said before, but expanding it, explaining that obligation did not bind one person to another permanently, only until balance was restored. Survival created a tie, she said, but choice determined its future. She did not look at him while she spoke, focusing instead on the careful stitching she had begun on her own clothing, her hands steady despite the effort. Silas listened without interruption, considering the difference between what she described and what he had assumed. The law she followed was not ownership. It was accountability. That distinction mattered. It changed the shape of the responsibility he felt without adding weight to it. "I won't decide for you," he said finally. "Not now. Not later." She glanced up then, studying his face for signs of contradiction. Finding none, she returned to her work. The exchange ended there, complete without conclusion. Later that night, distant gunfire echoed once across the land, too far to signal immediate danger, but close enough to sharpen attention. Silas stood slowly, instinct rising before thought, and moved to check the perimeter. Nayeli did not retreat or freeze. She rose as well, retrieving the knife she had set aside days earlier, not gripping it tightly, but holding it with familiarity. "Not for you," she said when she saw his glance. "For myself." He nodded. The distinction mattered. They waited in silence until the land returned to stillness. When nothing followed, Silas secured the door and extinguished the lantern, leaving only the low firelight. He did not insist she sleep. He did not take watch without her knowing. Instead, they remained awake together for a time, sharing the responsibility of attention, the burden lighter because it was no longer carried alone. The next morning brought heavy clouds and a sharp drop in temperature, signaling a shift that would shorten days and complicate travel. Silas recalculated supplies again, more carefully this time, accounting for winter not as a test to endure, but as a season to prepare for together. He realized then that his planning had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer adjusting for a guest. He was structuring for permanence. Nayeli noticed the change as well. She asked questions about storage, about routes he avoided once snow fell, about how long he usually remained isolated during the worst weather. Her interest was practical, not sentimental. She was evaluating whether this place could sustain more than survival, whether it could support continuity. When she told him she intended to remain through winter, at least until the land opened again, Silas did not respond immediately. He waited until he had finished stacking wood, until his breathing had steadied, until he could answer without revealing how much the words mattered. "That's your decision," he said at last. "If you stay, it's because you choose to, not because you owe me." She considered him carefully, then nodded once. "I know." That night, as the fire burned low and the wind pressed against the cabin walls, Silas lay awake longer than usual, not from unease, but from awareness. His life had been built to hold one man and his silence. Now, it held two people who understood the cost of staying and accepted it without illusion. Whatever lay ahead would not be simple, but it would be honest. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The first snow did not arrive suddenly or dramatically, but as a quiet certainty that settled over the land during the night, thinning sound, flattening distance, and changing the way every step had to be considered. Silas noticed it before dawn, when the cabin felt heavier, insulated not by warmth but by absence. And when he opened the door, the ground held a clean, pale layer that erased tracks and softened edges without forgiveness. Winter had not announced itself. It had simply arrived. This was the season he prepared for all year, not with optimism, but with discipline. Out here, winter did not test belief or courage. It tested attention. Mistakes accumulated faster when cold narrowed the margin for correction. Silas moved through the morning deliberately, checking the roofline for weakness, clearing snow from the entry, adjusting how the fire drew air. Each action was familiar, but this time he was aware of Nayeli watching, not idly but with intent. She joined him outside once the light strengthened enough to move safely, her steps cautious but controlled, her injury no longer dictating her posture, only reminding her where not to rush. The cold did not intimidate her. It sharpened her. Silas noticed how her awareness shifted immediately, how she tracked wind direction, how she noted where snow gathered unevenly against rock and fence. She had lived through winters like this before, though not here, not alone, and not after everything she had lost. They worked without instruction. She gathered kindling where the wind had broken branches naturally. He reinforced the shelter around the water barrels. Their movements did not mirror each other, but they aligned, each task complementing the other without overlap or waste. This was not cooperation learned through conversation. It was recognition. By midday, clouds pressed low enough to darken the horizon, and Silas made a decision he had not planned to voice until later. He told her he would move supplies from the outer storage into the cabin that afternoon, compressing his routines, accepting inconvenience in exchange for safety. In earlier years, he had resisted that shift, seeing it as surrender to the season rather than adaptation. Now it felt like preparation shared rather than burden increased. Naeli listened, then asked where he kept items he hoped he would never need. The question caught him off guard, not because it was invasive, but because it revealed her understanding of survival beyond optimism. Silas showed her the locked chest beneath the floorboard, the extra ammunition, the preserved medicine he rarely touched. He did not explain the stories behind them. He did not need to. She treated the contents with respect rather than curiosity, closing the space carefully when they were finished. Later, as they sorted grain and reorganized food stores, she spoke of her husband for the first time without distance in her voice. She did not describe his death. She described how he prepared for winter, how he believed that storing well was an act of care rather than fear, how he trusted routine more than luck. Silas listened, absorbing not just the words, but the rhythm of grief that no longer demanded space to exist. She spoke because she chose to, not because silence had become unbearable. When she finished, she did not look at Silas for comfort. She returned to her work. The restraint deepened something between them that neither named. The storm arrived before nightfall. Wind first, then snow thick enough to limit visibility to the length of the yard. Silas secured the cabin fully, adjusting his usual watch pattern, recognizing that movement outside would be inefficient and dangerous. For the first time since he had built the place, he accepted that remaining inside was not retreat. It was responsibility. As darkness settled, the cabin filled with a different kind of quiet, one shaped by containment rather than emptiness. Naeli prepared food while Silas tended the fire, their movements intersecting briefly and naturally, passing space without collision. When they sat down to eat, it was without ceremony, but the act felt deliberate. Shared meals during storms carried weight. They were acknowledgments. Afterward, Naeli stood by the window for a long moment, watching the snow move sideways, pressing against the glass as if testing it. When I was younger, she said, winter meant we stayed close. Stories were not for comfort. They were for memory. So we did not forget who we were. Silas considered that. I stopped telling mine, he admitted quietly. It was easier to leave them unfinished. She did not challenge that choice. She only said, stories do not disappear when they are not spoken. They wait. The fire burned low as the night deepened. Silas took his place near the door out of habit, then stopped, reconsidering. The storm outside made his old watch position symbolic rather than functional. Instead, he remained at the table, close enough to hear the wind change, close enough to respond if needed. Naeli noticed the shift and did not comment. Before sleeping, she asked a question that carried no demand, only clarity. If I remain here after winter ends, she said, will you expect me to leave? Silas did not answer immediately. He did not want to respond from relief or fear. He waited until the question settled properly. I won't expect anything from you, he said at last. But I won't pretend you're temporary either. She nodded slowly. The answer satisfied her not because it promised permanence, but because it refused to deny possibility. That night, the storm closed fully around the cabin, sealing them inside a shared space defined not by obligation or rescue, but by deliberate presence. Outside, the land erased paths and borders alike. Inside, two people accepted that whatever followed would be shaped not by law, not by survival alone, but by the quiet, ongoing choice to remain where they were. Winter did not loosen its grip quickly, but it did change character, shifting from force to endurance, and Silas understood that difference well enough to recognize when the worst had passed. The storms no longer arrived without warning. The cold remained, but it settled instead of attacking, allowing days to open in narrow, workable windows. On one such morning, he stepped outside and felt it immediately. Not warmth, but balance, the kind that told him the land was no longer trying to drive everything away. Naeli noticed the change before he mentioned it. She stood at the edge of the porch, wrapped in her coat, watching the horizon with focused attention, reading signs that did not belong to this place but translated easily enough. She had learned the land's habits quickly, not by replacing her own knowledge, but by layering it. That ability, Silas realized, was rare. Many people survived by adapting or by resisting. Few managed both. I could travel again, she said quietly, not as an announcement, but as an assessment. Silas nodded. He had already reached the same conclusion. The paths would hold within days. The risk had narrowed to something manageable. The option existed now, fully and honestly, and because of that, it carried weight. When survival stopped demanding stillness, choice became unavoidable. They did not speak about it immediately. The day required work. Snowmelt had weakened sections of the fence, and water runoff needed redirecting before it damaged the lower storage area. They moved through the tasks together, efficient, coordinated without instruction. Silas noticed how naturally she took responsibility for parts of the work that had once belonged only to him, not because he had given permission, but because the space had made room for her decisions. As they worked, Silas became aware of something else, quieter and more difficult to measure. He was no longer guarding his routines from intrusion. He was adjusting them willingly. The realization did not bring panic, but it did bring clarity. He had built his life to be narrow because narrow things were easier to control. What he had now was broader, less predictable, and more demanding. It was also more stable than anything he remembered. That afternoon, Nayeli asked him to walk with her beyond the near ridge, farther than she had gone since arriving. Silas hesitated only long enough to check the sky and pack supplies. The request carried intention. This was not exercise or curiosity. It was a boundary being tested, not of land, but of future. The walk was slow, deliberate, the snow crunching underfoot where it had frozen overnight. Nayeli set the pace without comment, aware of her body, aware of his. They stopped when the ridge dropped away into a wide basin, empty and exposed, a place where paths converged and then vanished again. She stood there for a long time, eyes scanning distance, breathing steady. "This is where I would turn," she said eventually. "If I leave." Silas absorbed the words without reaction. He did not ask why. He did not argue. He understood that places like this mattered, not because of where they led, but because of what they represented. Thresholds required acknowledgement. "What would you be going toward?" he asked instead. She considered that carefully. "Movement," she answered. "Familiar danger. Known loss. Things I already understand." He nodded. "And staying?" She turned to face him then, fully, her expression open but serious. "Staying is the unknown. Not because of the land. Because of what I would have to build." The honesty in her words struck him harder than any declaration could have. Silas felt the weight of his own answer forming before he allowed himself to speak. "I never planned to build anything again," he said. "I planned to maintain what I had until it wore out." They stood in silence, the wind moving lightly through the basin below, carrying no sound of riders, no threat, only distance. Silas realized then that this moment, this pause, mattered more than any vow. Nothing forced either of them to choose. That freedom made the decision real. They returned to the cabin before dusk. Inside, the familiar space felt subtly altered again, not by fear of loss, but by the possibility of commitment. That evening, Silas retrieved something he had not touched in years, a small carved marker he had once intended to place at the edge of the land, then never did. He set on the table without explanation. Nayeli examined it carefully. "You never finished," she observed. "I didn't know what name to carve," he replied. She met his gaze, understanding immediately that this was not an invitation made lightly. "Names matter," she said. "They should not be given until the place can hold them." Silas nodded. "That's why I waited." Later that night, they spoke plainly, not emotionally, not dramatically, but with the seriousness of people deciding the shape of their lives. Nayeli told him that if she stayed, it would not be as someone protected or obligated, but as an equal presence, sharing responsibility, risk, and outcome. Silas told her that if she remained, he would not withdraw in his silence to avoid loss, nor would he control what he feared to lose. They reached agreement not through compromise, but through alignment. Nothing was surrendered. Nothing was demanded. When they lay down to sleep, they did so with awareness, not urgency, the space between them deliberate but diminished, no longer defensive. Outside, the night was clear, the sky cold and open. Inside, the cabin held two people who had reached the edge of decision and stepped forward without illusion. The choice had not yet been spoken aloud, but it no longer needed to be. It was already shaping the days ahead. Spring arrived without asking permission, not as a sudden release from winter, but as a steady reclaiming of ground, day by day, light by light, until the land no longer resisted being lived on. Silas noticed it in the way the soil softened underfoot, in how the mornings stretched longer before cold asserted itself, and in the sound of water moving again where silence had held for months. The season did not erase hardship. It replaced endurance with possibility. By then, the cabin no longer felt like a shelter adapted for two. It felt intentional. Tools rested where both hands could reach them. Supplies were stored with shared logic. Paths between door, well, and fence had been reinforced not by habit, but by agreement. Nothing about the place looked transformed to an outsider. The change lived in how decisions were made and how responsibility moved between them without friction. Nayeli rose early now, often before Silas, not to prove strength, but because her body had relearned trust in its own balance. The injury that once dictated her limits had faded into memory, leaving only a faint reminder of where caution still belonged. She worked without rushing, choosing tasks that mattered rather than tasks that filled time, and Silas adjusted his own rhythm to match without comment. Neither led, neither followed. They moved as if guided by the same internal measure. The first planting was done together, not ceremonially, but carefully, each seed placed with attention rather than hope. Silas explained the ground, where water held longer, where wind stripped moisture too quickly. Nayeli listened, then offered her own understanding of timing and spacing, not from this land, but from others like it. The result was not compromise. It was integration. The soil received both. Later that week, they rode together for the first time, not as patrol or defense, but as survey, mapping what winter had altered and what remained reliable. Nayeli handled the horse with quiet authority, familiar with movement that required cooperation rather than command. Silas watched her with an awareness that carried no need to intervene. Trust, he realized, did not arrive all at once. It accumulated through moments where restraint proved more effective than control. They stopped at the basin where paths converged and ended, the same place where decision had first been acknowledged without being spoken. The ground there had changed, softened by meltwater, marked by new growth stubborn enough to break through. Nayeli dismounted and walked a short distance alone, then returned without looking back. "I do not need to choose movement to survive," she said simply. Silas nodded. "Neither do I." The words closed something that had remained open, not as a door shut, but as a direction confirmed. When they returned to the cabin, Silas retrieved the carved marker again, the unfinished piece that had waited years without purpose. This time, he set it outside, near the place where the land began to slope toward the wash, a boundary that marked not ownership, but intention. He carved slowly, deliberately, allowing the work to take the time it required. Nayeli watched without interrupting. When he finished, she knelt beside him and traced the letters with her fingers, her expression steady. "This place can hold a name now," she said. "It can hold more than one," Silas replied. They spoke later, inside, with the fire low and the light clean, about what staying meant in practical terms. There were no vows shaped by fear of loss, no promises that denied risk. They spoke of shared work, of decision-making that required consultation rather than permission, of children not as obligation, but as future chosen rather than owed. Nayeli spoke of sacred law again, this time not as structure imposed by belief, but as meaning shaped by outcome. "Survival created the tie," she said, "but staying makes it real." Silas accepted that without resistance. "Then we stay," he said. The commitment was not marked by ceremony witnessed by others, but by action repeated consistently enough to remove doubt. They combined resources, adjusted boundaries, and marked time not by seasons endured, but by progress made. When Silas asked Nayeli to share his name fully, it was not framed as request or claim. It was an invitation to continuity. She accepted it openly. The following weeks brought visitors, few and cautious, drawn by rumor of land maintained rather than abandoned. Silas met them without hostility, Naeli beside him, visible and unhidden. The presence changed how others measured the place. It was no longer a man alone at the edge of nowhere. It was a household with structure and resolve. No one challenged it. By early summer, the cabin held sounds Silas had not anticipated allowing back into his life. Shared laughter brief and unguarded. Conversation that did not require silence to feel complete. Plans spoken without needing to be defended. The land responded as it always did. Indifferent but receptive, rewarding care without favor. One evening, as the lights softened and the day's work settled into stillness, Naeli stood at the doorway and looked out across the ground they now tended together. She did not speak immediately. When she did, her voice held certainty rather than emotion. "I am not here because I was saved," she said. "I am here because I was allowed to choose." Silas stood beside her, the space between them gone without needing to be crossed. "So it was I," he replied. They remained there as the light faded, not watching for threat, not measuring distance, simply present in a life that no longer required defense against connection. The past had not been erased. It had been placed where it belonged, acknowledged without dominance. The story ended not with relief, but with stability. Two people who had arrived at the same place through different losses chose to build forward without illusion, bound not by sacred law alone, nor by survival, but by deliberate shared commitment. The land held them. The future remained open, and for the first time, that openness felt like peace.